All right. Well, so thank you everybody for joining in these really testing, challenging, and pressing times. Absolutely unprecedented events, but thank you very much for your interest and for joining. So, on behalf of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and Prayas Energy Group, I would like to welcome everybody to this webinar on grid scale battery storage, costs, value, and regulatory framework in India. So let me quickly start by introducing myself. So my name is Nikita Abhyankar. I'm a scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, which is a US Department of Energy's National Energy Research Laboratory located in Berkeley, close to San Francisco, where about 4,000 to 5,000 scientists laboratory with over 13 Nobel Prizes and over 16 elements of the periodic table have been discovered at our laboratory, and we're pretty mighty proud of that. So now, without further ado, let's quickly begin. So before beginning, let me just quickly go over a few housekeeping rules. So we have by default muted everybody's audio and video, but just to remind you, if you are not speaking, if you are joining by phone, please mute your audio so other people are not distracted. And also a quick request for the panelists is if you're not speaking, not right now, we want all the panelists with their video on, but if you're not speaking later, please turn your video as well as audio off so we don't hit any bandwidth constraints. Then about other housekeeping rules during the webinar is if you look at your kind of Zoom controls, you will see two buttons, chat as well as Q&A. So if you have any questions that you want to pose, please use the Q&A button. We are actively monitoring that. Some of the panelists and authors will try to answer those questions live in the chat window or in the Q&A window, I'm sorry. And later we also have a moderated Q&A session where we'll also select a few questions and we'll direct those questions to the right panelists or authors. We also encourage the chat, so you can use the chat button to discuss amongst participants. We do encourage that. Please do not pose any questions for panelists or authors in the chat window. And also, we also request you, please do not post any promotional material in the chat window. So that's that. Let's quickly go over how we're going to run the program today. We have the privilege and honor of having some stellar panelists for our webinar. So in addition to all the authors of the report, we have four panelists. First, Dr. Sushanta Chatterjee, who I think everybody in the electricity sector in India knows. He is Chief of Regulatory Affairs at Central Electricity Regulatory Commission. He's going to provide the opening remarks of the webinar and also going to touch upon some of the key regulatory aspects of the battery storage in India. Then we have Dr. YBK Reddy, who is the Additional General Manager of Solar Energy Corporation of India, SECI, really moving the envelope and really expanding the envelope on renewable energy costs, and also new hybrid renewable energy storage and solar wind projects in India, really pushing the envelope. So he will provide some remarks on SECI strategy and other strategies for deployment of storage after the main presentation. And we have Mr. Deepak Gupta, who is Vice President of Renew Power. Again, most of the people in the power sector in India know Deepak very well. Renew Power has been at the center and forward of most of the solar storage and other hybrid projects in India recently. So we'll also provide a very interesting perspective on what are the key strategies for cost-effective deployment of storage. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Rahul Walawalkar, President of the India Energy Storage Alliance, who would also provide a supply chain and an industry perspective on how a rollout of battery storage could happen, what could be the key issues, and so on and so forth. But before we turn to Dr. Chatterjee for providing the opening remarks, let me quickly introduce the authors of this report. So we have Ms. Shruti Devra, who is a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, who has led most of this analytical work on this report. Then we also have Mr. Ashwin Gambhir, who is a research fellow at Prayas Energy Group. And we also have Mr. Siddharth Arora, who is a senior regulatory officer at Maharashtra Electricity Regulatory Commission, and myself, Nikita Bhyankar, from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I'm a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Okay, so without further ado, so let me turn to Dr. Chatterjee for providing some opening remarks as well as some regulatory aspects on battery storage. So a request to all panelists, please keep your remarks to about 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. Good morning and good evening, everybody, and thanks, Nikit, very much for nice introduction. It's an honor for me to be here, making opening remarks on the launch of this report. I have had the privilege of being associated with almost all the authors and also with LBNL for quite some time. So have been through this report, and it's quite encouraging to see that this report has now been published and is being subjected to public scrutiny, should I say, because some of the numbers that this report has thrown would definitely be subject to public scrutiny, and the more they are scrutinized by public, the better it is for us as policymakers and regulators here in India, because those numbers often serve as reference points for us for more informed decisions at the Government of India level or at the regulators. So the report, briefly about the report, I would say that it's highly timely and relevant for India at this moment. I think all across the globe, countries have been trying to find out the kind and extent of policy and regulatory support and intervention that is required to encourage battery storage. India is no exception. We have also been trying our level best in India in trying to encourage battery storage. Given this background, I say that this report is really very timely, especially some of the numbers. As policymakers and regulators in India, whenever you talk about the battery storage, the first thing that comes to your mind is whether it is going to be cost prohibitive. That's a major challenge for any developing country, but of late I have discovered that cost price are not possibly sensitive issues only for developing country, but almost for all countries across the globe, even the advanced and developed countries. So India is no exception. Whenever we talk about battery storage, the first natural question that comes is, how expensive is it going to be? Are we going to be able to afford it? So it's in that context, some of the numbers that this report has thrown are quite encouraging, like 1 rupee 44 paise as the adder by 2020 and 1 rupee by 2025, and less than 1 rupee in the range of about 80 paise per unit as the adder, as the price adder in 2030. These numbers, to me as a regulator, are quite encouraging because by and large, the understanding is that battery storage possibly becomes more viable when it gets combined with any of the renewable energy resources, especially solar, given the fast declining cost and price of the solar. If we can have battery storage, the desired firmness that we expect aspect of the variable RE that would come, and that would help help integrate the renewable more seamlessly, and also address some of the major concerns of a system operator. Because the larger the penetration, the greater the nightmare for a system operator. And in terms of balancing whatever commercial framework you put in place, but ultimately the load generation balance has to be maintained by the system operator. And if we can have renewable energy with battery storage at a cost-effective rate, this is going to go a long way in India in terms of providing the desired firmness and seamless integration of the variable renewable energy sources in the country. Another important feature which I see of this report is that it has basically created a scope for, or left a window for a further research on another important element of what we call resource adequacy, or for that matter, the future generation planning. This report has not gone into detail about the generation planning, but then possibly one of the recommendations is to have a look at the generation planning, given the fast declining prices of solar and also of solar and renewable, based on the projections that this report gives. One tacit recommendation is in this report is to have a relook at the generation planning, whether given these numbers, is it a good idea to explore options other than pure play thermal capacity addition that we have generally in mind. So I'm sure with the kind of expertise that LBNL and other participating authors have, they would come up with some more robust kind of a framework and recommendation based on evidence-based analysis and simulations going forward in terms of the right way forward as they think for India in terms of future generation planning. So these were the two important elements which I felt I must highlight of the report, which are of great relevance for policymakers and regulators in India, especially for days to come. Another important reason as to why I consider this report as very important is the number. You know, whenever, I mean, we in the recent past have come up with regulations, with renewable energy tariff regulations, where we have provided for project specific tariff for renewable energy with storage, or even hybrid with storage. There is a provision in the regulation whereby we say that if a specific project comes for a cost plus tariff and not competitive, we would possibly welcome that, and then we would, and assuming some such projects come for project specific tariff in future to the central regulator, these numbers that this report have thrown would definitely serve as a reference point for us in terms of more informed decision. Even in India, we have already taken a number of initiatives, and the report covers at length some of the initiatives that the government has taken, some of the initiatives that have been taken by government agencies in terms of inviting bids based on solar plus or renewable plus storage. Numbers are also now well known. In terms of the regulatory support and initiative, we have also taken a number of initiatives, which, for instance, we have been talking about, and some of the panelists have also been in dialogue and talk with us for quite some time in terms of what kind of regulatory interventions are really required to promote and encourage renewables. We have always been holding, see, India is unique, and so is any country. Because whenever you think of any kind of a policy or a regulatory intervention, you need to understand the milieu and ethos of the country. And possibly you cannot always expect the same kind of intervention as you would have seen elsewhere in the world, because every country comes up with its own background, with its own market design. The market design here is so different. But given all this, the couple of initiatives which the Central Commission here in India has taken, in my opinion, is going to go a long way in further encouraging and integrating the storage. First, a couple of points I'll just mention. I know the limitations of time. Like the connectivity regulations. I mean, we have recognized, even standalone battery storage as an entity which can get connected to the system. We have defined energy storage in our connectivity regulations. That was the starting point. Followed by that, I briefly mentioned about the renewable energy tariff regulations, and we are talking about the project-specific tariff. Next, in the offing, and where we have been discussing, are some of the broad contours which we are going to define in the Indian Electricity Grid Code, which is likely to get revamped. Already an expert committee report is available in the website of CERC. There, the report, the expert group has gone into details in terms of carving out role for energy storage. It's a good pointer. People can have a look at that, right from the COD, the entity energy storage, battery storage has been recognized. It figures almost in all and major chapters, including your COD in terms of your ancillary services, reserves requirement, as well as your scheduling process. The next thing which is in the offing, and many people have been expecting, is in terms of a regulatory framework, separate regulatory framework for ancillary services, where we can provide some push. That is also something which is under discussion. Yes, we have been discussing this issue for quite some time, because as I said, the ground reality is in terms of integrating the battery storage in different types of ancillary services. They need to be factored in before we can take. But then, yes, next couple of months, you can at least have a look at initiatives from the regulators on the IEGC as well as ancillary services front, insofar as the battery storage is concerned. So that's in brief, Nikit and the entire team. From my side, in terms of the opening remarks, I once again congratulate all the authors who have put in efforts in compiling, collating, and I'm sure this report will go a long way in providing a reference document for us policymakers and regulators. Thank you. Over to you, Nikki.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sushanta, for those excellent remarks, and also providing the regulatory context and chalking out some of the next steps in terms of where the regulations are headed. So I'm not going to tell you what you already see on this slide. I mean, how the presentation is organized. Just a quick change of program, though. Initially, we were planning to wrap up the webinar at 11 a.m. India time, but given that there is so much interest, many questions are coming up. So we would like to extend it up to 11:15 a.m. India time. So people, if you want to drop off at 11 a.m., we understand, but the webinar will go on at least for 15 to 20 minutes after 11 a.m. So the next part of the session is we'll give you a detailed presentation on the report that we have recently published on estimating the costs of battery storage. We'll also present some of our ongoing analysis what is the relevance and the value of battery storage in India, especially taking a medium to long-term perspective up to 2030 or so. And we'll briefly discuss what are the key policy and regulatory issues, which Dr. Chatterjee has already touched upon. So let me quickly turn it over to Ashwin Gambhir of Prayas Energy Group to just set the motivation, set the context, and walk us through what are the key global trends pretty quickly.
Thank you, Nikhil. Can you move on to the next slide? Yeah, I think this is mainly the most important motivation and context is the battery prices, which have seen a very significant fall already, around 80 to 85% in the last decade or so. And the more promising news that this trajectory is not slowing down. We are well way on that trajectory, and the numbers are very, very promising, as Dr. Chatterjee mentioned in his opening remarks. So this is essentially the context and motivation for the interest in storage, the scalability of storage, the modularity of storage, and most importantly, the price attractiveness and the value attractiveness going ahead. So this is essentially the context and motivation why we came together to put and research this topic for India. Next. The other thing that we have seen recently is the SECI tenders on hybrid renewables in India, and we have very excellent panelists, two of them, one of them from SECI who handles all these solar tenders, and one of the IPPs, Renew, Deepak from IPP, who has won two of these tenders. So I won't go into too much detail, but to give a context that, plain, as SECI mentions, plain vanilla solar and wind is moving on to more hybrid renewables. And so the first example was the 1200 megawatt peak power tender, which saw a peak tariff of 6.3, where Renew is actually putting in electric storage, and the off-peak tariff was already set at 288. And this combines to a level-edged tariff of around 4 rupees, which is quite attractive for the amount of flexibility and dispatchability you get in day ahead. And the capacity factor on average would be around 40%. The second one is the round the clock tender, 400 megawatts. This is round the clock in a sense that you have a minimum 80% annual CUF and a minimum 70% monthly, but this is not dispatchable, and it's not round the clock for every hour in the sense that we know. Still, we have discovered a very attractive tariff of 291 in the first year, escalating at 3%, which gives you a levelized tariff of just below 3.6. So this is also very, very attractive. And the other tender, which is in yet to be, prices are yet to be discovered, is the merging of RE and some either stranded thermal assets or other thermal assets, where you have a minimum requirement of 51% renewable. So the sense is that we are moving on to more complex tenders, or more tenders which offer more value and dispatchability and flexibility to the procurers, and the price point even in 2020 or 2021 is quite attractive. So this is essentially the context why we came together to study storage, especially in the Indian context. I will stop here and now hand it over to Shruti.
Thank you, Ashwin. Namaskar and a very good morning to everybody joining from India. So in the United States, the storage deployment is rapidly surging as the costs continue to decline. So US has 40% of global grid scale batteries installed as of end of 2019. Solar plus storage is becoming the new normal here. We see a quarter of all renewable capacity in the interconnection queue paired with storage. So that's about 70 gigawatts of planned RE capacity over the next few years, most of which is solar, which is paired with about 30 gigawatts of storage. This chart that you see here plots PPA prices for solar plus storage systems in the US in dollars per megawatt hour versus the percentage of solar energy stored in the battery. These prices include 30% federal investment tax credit, or the ITC. So as you can see, there are the green triangles that are plotting the contract prices. The only orange square there is a standalone battery system. And the boxes next to these data points tell us the name of the procuring utility as well as the installation date. So the projects that came online in 2018, 2019 were close to around 40 to 70 dollars per megawatt hour, but now this is dropping to as low as $22 or $25 per megawatt hour. So just to put it in Indian context, that's less than 2 rupees per unit for 13% energy stored in battery. And you can see a cluster of those data points procured by Nevada Energy on the bottom left corner of the chart. So the tariff adder, or the PPA adder, which is like the additional battery cost when added to the solar PPA price, was only $5 per megawatt hour for this 13% of storage in Nevada Energy projects. And if you move up to the LADWP project, which is 52% storage, the tariff adder was $20 per megawatt hour. This is a project expected to come online in 2023. It's a 400 megawatt solar paired with 300 megawatt and 1200 megawatt hours of batteries. Next slide, please. So as we can see, the market evidence points to increasing feasibility of grid scale batteries for integrating renewables on the grid. But when we started this work early last year, the available estimates in India we thought were not reflecting these market trends. So we have adopted a two-pronged approach to estimate the levelized cost of grid-scale lithium-ion batteries in India. The first one being the market-based, where we take the recent PPA prices that you saw on the previous slide, and we scale the storage component of that using appropriate financing assumptions to reflect the difference in interest rates between India and US. The second approach is a bottom-up cost analysis to validate that these market-based bids are not outliers. For the bottom-up estimate, our hypothesis is that a battery storage system is structurally similar to a PV system, where instead of the panels, you have the battery packs with a bidirectional inverter, along with the balance of system. And if we observe closely, the BOS elements in a battery system and a PV system are quite similar. So in this analysis, we take the battery pack prices, the global forecasts available from BNEF, and then we take the US benchmark costs for BOS, for EPC and soft costs such as contingency and developer overheads, and we scale them using comparison of similar cost categories in solar systems. And these cost estimates are available for us from US as well as from India. Now, using these bottom-up capital costs, we arrive at the levelized cost of storage, or the LCOS, which is the discounted cost per unit of discharged electrical energy. And here, some of our important assumptions to note is a 10-year battery pack life, assuming daily cycling, a project life of 20 years, so we assume one battery pack replacement at the end of 10 years. We have a 1% degradation every year, an O&M cost of annual 1% of CapEx, and a nominal interest rate of 11%. Next slide, please. So these are our estimates from the first approach, which is scaling the US market data. Here you see our estimates for a subset of the points you saw on the chart. First, we take the US data points and scale them up to remove the effect of 30% federal ITC. Then the PV or the solar component of the PPA price is scaled by the ratio of average PPA prices in India versus US in 2019. And we see that the PPA prices or typical PPA prices in India were about 35% higher than the US. Then the storage component of the PPA price is scaled based on the difference in financing costs. So we assume that the nominal interest rate in India is double of that in the US, so 11% versus a 5.5%. And due to that, we see that India estimates are about 34% higher than what we see in the US. So if we look at the rightmost column on this table, we see the estimates in rupees per kWh. So for a system with 13% energy stored in battery for 2021 delivery, our estimate is about 3 rupees per unit. And for a system which has about 50% energy stored in battery and 2023 delivery, our estimate is about 5 rupees a unit. So as we can see, the adder for storage here is about 50 paisa for the 13% system, and about 2.5 rupees for the 50% system. Next slide, please. This slide gives us the results of our bottom-up cost analysis for a 1 megawatt, 4 megawatt hour system, and all prices in the table are in dollar per kilowatt hour. On the left, you see the prices for a standalone battery system, and on the right, for a system that's co-located with a solar PV plant. And on the right, we see that we have a 40% saving in BOS costs, and hence the capital cost estimates are lower. So the component level benchmark costs for solar PV from the US are compared with the same cost for India from last available CERC RE tariff order. And we observe that the ratios of cost categories, such as for BOS, excluding inverter, for India, it's 50% lower. And for soft costs in India, they are 60% lower. And if you'd like more details, you can look up the appendices in the report. We exclude land costs and local fees and taxes here because they are very localized and very different for India and US. So in this analysis shows that the India capex is about 24% lower than the US benchmark costs. And then we take the current capital costs and project them for over the next decade, assuming pack prices projections coming from BNEF, the chart that you saw on the first slide, and about 5% reduction in all other cost categories. As we can see, the total capital cost of a standalone or a co-located system is expected to halve over the next decade. Next slide, please. So this slide gives us our estimates for the levelized cost of storage, or the LCOS, on the left side for a standalone system and on the right for a co-located system in India. And again, this is a 1 megawatt, 4 megawatt hour battery storage system. So LCOS is similar to LCOE, or levelized cost of energy from an RE plant, but it incorporates factors such as round trip efficiency and battery degradation over time. As we can see, the LCOS of battery systems in India is expected to drop by 42% over the next decade. So if you see for a co-located system, this is less than 4 rupees by 2030. So what does that mean? It means that, let's say, if we want to add diurnal flexibility to about 20 to 25% of RE generation, it would cost us an additional 70 to 80 paisa by 2030. In our report, we also show some sensitivity analysis on important variables, so which are your battery pack prices, excuse me, BOS costs, interest rate, battery life. And we note that the interest rate has the biggest impact on the LCOS estimates, followed by the battery pack price. This demonstrates, the importance of lower financing costs and, in general, the policy and regulatory framework for new technologies. Next slide, please. So as we can see that many battery installations are coming about to be co-located with a solar or wind plant, it's worthwhile to examine the expected total PPA price for such a system. And this price depends on the fraction of solar or wind energy that is stored in and discharged by the battery. That you see on the x-axis going from 10% to 100%. And here we take an example of a solar PV plant. So the blue bars give you a typical solar PPA price expected in 2025. We assume it to be 2.3 rupees per unit. And the orange bars is giving the additional cost of storage for that storage capacity. So for example, what that means is, let's say you want to extend solar generation into evening peak hours. So that would cost us about 3 to 3.5 rupees per unit in the 2025-2030 timeframe. If you want to extend the solar generation further to 15 hours, that would be about 4 to 5 rupees per kilowatt hour. These numbers actually align quite well with our market-based estimates. As I had mentioned, the adders of 50 paisa and 2.5 rupees. And again, more details can be found in the report. Now I would like to hand it over to Nikit to talk about what these costs mean in terms of system planning and operations, and also to elaborate on some of the regulatory aspects that Dr. Chatterjee mentioned. Over to you, Nikit.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So now that we have essentially talked about what we see as the storage or the potential storage costs in India, now let's talk about the value aspect of storage in India. So these are the 4 questions that we really want to answer in these next few minutes. First is, what is the value of energy storage in India? Does it add any capacity value? What is the energy value, ancillary benefits, and so on and so forth? Second is, how would the storage generally be dispatched in India for the aggressive renewable targets that India has set itself? Third is, how much storage is required? Are we talking about a 2-hour storage, 4 hours, 6 hour, 12 hour, and so on? And fourth, and this question has also come up in one of the Q&A windows, is how do battery storage costs compare with some of the alternative technologies? And most prominently, that is currently being discussed in India in the policy circles, is pumped hydro. So let's do a quick comparison of battery storage costs with pumped hydro costs. So we are going to be very brief in the way we cover these questions, but we'll be happy to discuss more on those in the Q&A session after the panelists make their comments. Okay, so now let's start with the first 3 questions. What is the value of storage in India? How would the storage be dispatched? And how much storage would be required? So we try to answer that question by simulating how the Indian electricity system will be dispatched in some future years, say 2030 or so, because that is definitely an year of interest, with very high renewable energy penetration. So we take the numbers of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy penetration in India by 2030, 300 gigawatts solar, 140 gigawatts wind. These come from the CEA's draft optimal capacity expansion report. And then we simulate how would the system operate with these 450 gigawatts of renewables installed into the system. Now this chart shows the average hourly dispatch in 4 key months in the year 2030. So the x-axis shows the hour during a typical day or an average day in the 4 months, January, April, July, and October. And the y-axis shows the hourly generation or load in that hour. Okay. So there are kind of 3 major observations in here. First of all, just look at the renewable energy generation, particularly wind and solar energy generation. Wind is the green area, solar is the yellow or orange area. So in all the months, the peak demand contribution, particularly evening peak demand contribution, around 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., with the exception of monsoon or in July, with the exception of monsoon season where wind contributes significantly, the renewable energy provides very little evening peak power. And despite significant expansion of the air conditioning load in India, we still believe for the next, in the medium to long run, India will still remain to be an evening peaking system. Although the afternoon peaking, because of air conditioning, would be significant, but the actual peak load on the system nationally would still occur in the evening, and that's why this evening peaking question becomes absolutely crucial. So the first observation is renewable energy contribution during evening peak, and especially during the months of highest net load, which is load minus renewable generation, which happens to be October. October evening peak is what really determines what is the overall system capacity, generation capacity that is required to meet that load. And during that period, the contribution of renewable energy is very small. Now, many utilities are already shifting agricultural load to solar hours, like Karnataka, Maharashtra, Telangana, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and several other utilities are also joining, and they will continue to do that in the future as well. But and that would essentially reduce the nighttime load that the agricultural sector consumes, and that would shift the agricultural load to solar hours, which would reduce the nighttime thermal energy requirement and increase the load during the solar hours for better solar integration. However, the agricultural load during evening peak hours is as it is very small. So that's why even if agricultural load is shifted, the evening peak requirement still doesn't change much. And this is where the role of future investment planning comes in. If one still keeps on adding the traditional thermal power to meet the peaking load, given that India doesn't have a lot of gas resources, hydro resources take time to develop, and nuclear resources also take time to develop. So if India keeps on adding thermal resources, then it's quite likely that significant portion of the new thermal assets or significant portion of the existing thermal assets will likely operate at very low capacity factors. But that capacity will still be required to meet the peak, but capacity factor or the PLFs would be extremely low. So this essentially makes their average cost of generation very high because of the low PLF, and also makes some of those plants economically unviable. And this is where the value addition of batteries plays a crucial role. So if you look at the blue arrows and the maroon area, maroon shade filled area, that's how the batteries would likely be dispatched in India. So again, this is no surprise. Batteries would likely charge. So that's why a negative generation during the middle of the day, they charge with excess solar energy or excess wind energy in case of monsoon, and then they discharge during the evening peak hours between 7 or 8 p.m. to about 9 or 10 p.m. and also discharge somewhat during the morning peak hours on the next day. So in all, we see batteries will likely be discharged for about 4 to 6 hours per day, assuming agricultural load in the night time, a large part of that is shifted to solar hours. So now this really jeopardizes some of the new thermal assets that could be built and operate at low capacity factor. And given the cost numbers that Shruti has shown, this solar or renewable plus storage, renewable plus storage costs will be much lower than low PLF thermal power costs, and that's why there is really a need to assess those new thermal capacity investments that India has been planning. Now the next question is how much storage is required. So again, our analysis shows that about 300 to 400 gigawatt hours of battery storage, which is roughly equivalent to about 10 to 15% of the average daily renewable generation, is found to be cost effective by 2030 for reliable grid integration of 450 gigawatts of renewable capacity. Now this is with the presumption that a large part of the agricultural load is shifted to solar hours. If that agricultural load is not shifted to solar hours, then the storage requirement would likely go up. Now, while I essentially talked about battery storage, but this is truly applicable for any energy storage, so to speak. Now, the next question is, if we are talking about energy storage, then what is the most cost-effective energy storage technology? Now, obviously, there are several energy storage technologies that have been under discussion, ranging from hydrogen to compressed air to molten salt to pumped hydro, and of course, battery storage, which is the focus. So let's quickly compare the two major energy storage options that are at least being considered in the policy circles in India: pumped hydro and battery storage. So this table shows the levelized cost of storage for pumped hydro and battery storage systems. Again, each storage system split into two. One is co-located with solar in case of battery storage and standalone systems. And in case of pumped hydro, just addition of the pump component to the existing hydro stations. So that only involves essentially the new electromechanical equipment and potentially some civil works that may be required for the penstock and other construction. And the other is a new build pumped hydro, which is a completely new greenfield pumped hydro project. So what we find is, if the cost-effective energy storage dispatch, as we found in the previous slide, is roughly about 4 to 6 hours, then for 4 to 6 hours of diurnal cycling, the levelized cost of pumped hydro systems is far higher than that of battery storage systems. For about 4 to 6 hours, battery storage systems are clearly much lower cost than the pumped hydro systems. And this is in addition to the severe construction time lags and land requirements and the specific site requirements of the pumped hydro systems. But the key question is pumped hydro systems are megawatt constrained, while battery systems are megawatt hour constraints. So if you just change those number of hours of storage, so the question is, instead of 4 to 6 hours, what if India actually requires 10 to 12 hours of diurnal storage requirement? Then the answer is likely different. So for lower number of storage hours, battery storage is definitely far more cost effective than pumped hydro, as seen in both charts. So one chart shows the levelized cost of storage for co-located system, and the other chart shows the levelized cost of storage for standalone new systems. And orange is pumped hydro, blue is batteries. So for up to 10 to 12 hours of storage, battery storage is still more cost effective. But beyond 10 to 12 hours of storage, so what we really call as the long duration storage, pumped hydro starts becoming more cost effective than battery storage. So now the next question is, we talked about cost, we talked about value, we talked about how it could be dispatched, the comparative economics, and now how could it essentially be deployed. So Dr. Chatterjee has touched upon some of the regulatory, key regulatory issues. So I'm going to be very, very quick in covering what are the key considerations for regulatory framework for battery storage in India. First is the regulators really need a more robust and nuanced resource adequacy framework, where the utilities need to show what resources they have procured, for what purpose, for what hours, which is seasonally nuanced and diurnally nuanced. And this also comes from developing some of the cost effectiveness criteria for evaluating the storage bids, and also for valuing storage and providing some guidelines for the procurement of new storage systems. The third important aspect of this is developing rules for market participation, especially participation in the real time and the day ahead energy markets of energy storage systems, particularly allowing market participants to change the direction instantaneously in the wholesale electricity markets. The next regulatory issue that has, for accelerating the cost-effective deployment, that has worked pretty well in the US, particularly in California, is some technology-neutral deployment mandate, where the commission mandates utilities to procure, say, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 10 gigawatt hours of storage capacity at the least cost. And the next few issues essentially link to the key ancillary services framework that the regulators need to put up, set the ancillary service requirements, and can system operators be asked to procure part of such ancillary service requirements, so the market essentially has enough liquidity in the system. So these are some of the key topics. We'll be more than happy to discuss those in detail in the Q&A session. So I think we have already gone significantly over time. So without wasting further time, again, I want to thank you for your attention. I quickly want to turn to our stellar panelists to get their views on battery storage, and also some of the strategies for cost-effective deployment in the future. So I'll turn to Dr. YBK Reddy from SECI to present his views, please. Please restrict your views to about 5 to 6 minutes, please. Thank you. Dr. Reddy? Okay, so I think looks like maybe Dr. Reddy is having some difficulties. So let me turn to Mr. Deepak Gupta, Vice President of Renew Power, to present his views and his strategies.
Thanks, Nikit, and thanks all the authors for sharing this very detailed and very, very timely analysis I think if someone focuses on the analysis that you all just shared in depth, probably no questions have remained unanswered. Still, I would like to add few bits to coming from a business side and also coming from our recent experiences. So first of all, I think your analysis is good in terms of working out different combinations of where does it make sense, where does it not make sense, which kind of technology, and particularly on the value proposition of storage. I think that's where a lot of while businesses have in the initial phase a limited role. In that sense, it's ideally either SECI or distribution companies who have to define their requirement. But at the same time, research institutions like LBNL and Prayas can actually play a very, very significant role in all of us understanding what the requirements are. And it's heartening to see the analysis in terms of it suggesting that the maximum value actually at a project level, and again, storage is required. I think there is no gainsaying that storage is not required or what should be done. The way I see Indian grid evolving, storage is required at different levels, at distribution level, transmission level, generation level, and even at the consumer level in some specific cases. But where is it that and what quantum of it does provide maximum value to the system as a whole is a significant enough question that needs to be asked and that needs to be responded. So in that sense, I think I like that part of the analysis, that up to something like, and my takeaway is up to something like 10% of the energy to be stored at project level seems to be making maximum economic sense at current times, or maybe for next at least 5 to 6 years, till storage prices drop significantly. And it can be a technology agnostic thing in that sense, while you have done again a comparison of pumped storage vis-a-vis battery storage. But fact remains, ultimately it all depends on what services are required by the grid operators, by the distribution companies, and ultimately by the consumers. And to that extent, technology agnostic tenders or bid requirements requiring not more than 10% storage at the energy level seems to be something that will go very well for next maybe 5 to 7 years. Then again, there are obviously inherent benefits of co-locating storage with generation. And again, when we did our analysis for peak power tender, for RTC tender and others, we realized that if there is a lot more energy storage required at this point in time, then that would make the overall project unviable from a distribution company standpoint, and may not actually add a lot of value to the system as a whole. Also, because fact remains, it is always possible if large scale battery storage is required at a future point in time, then that can very well be sourced by distribution company through SECI or directly as a separate storage service. And therefore, at this point in time, the kind of tender that SECI came up with, for example, the peak power or RTC, required minimum or certain limited level of storage, and that probably is the right design, at least for next 4 to 5 years, which again, thankfully, your analysis is also suggesting. And I firmly believe that as developers, Renew, where I come from, which is sort of the largest renewable energy company in India with operational assets of 5.5 gigawatts and a pipeline of another almost 5 gigawatts, we truly believe we'll be happy to play a role in this evolving need of the grid, evolving need of the sector, provided the rules of the game are very, very clear, and that the bids are designed in a manner which focus on outcomes, which is again what SECI has wonderfully done in, for example, RTC tender, where they only defined outcomes rather than defining what should go in. And something like 80% annual CUF, 70% monthly CUF takes it very close to being a much better product for distribution company and for the grid operator as a whole, without costing too much. And whatever examples Shruti showed in terms of what US utilities have done, and again, there are examples of 50%, 70%, 80% kind of energy storage. Let's admit that for India, even if we try to go to those levels, fact remains, seasonal variability is something that we may not be totally able to deal with project level energy storage assets. And we may still have to go with a combination of grid level energy storage assets as well as some generation assets, possibly either on the gas side or some peak power plants, or maybe utilizing our old fleet of thermal power plants in an effective manner for those 2 months or 3 months where renewable energy may not be able to play that significant a role. Then just one additional thing that I would like to highlight here, actually the role of wind in this entire scheme of things is something which at the policy making level, decision making level, as well as even at the research level, has been fairly subdued or underestimated. Actually, wind as a resource can really play a much more significant role, which again, Nikit, you showed in your graphs for example, July. And while the coincident national peak may be happening in somewhere in October, but fact remains there are multiple states which have their peaks occurring in different parts of the year or different months of the year. And other than just about 2 to 3 months, wind actually plays a very, very coincidental to peak load, which is the evening peak load particularly that we are talking about. And the role of that is something which which needs to be studied, which needs to be properly evaluated in context. And accordingly, generation planning needs to be done. Now the absolute last thing in my opening remarks, as on date, our distribution companies are still not well equipped in one way of looking at things to really do optimal generation planning. And again, this is not to comment on their ability, rather it is more so because our demand curves are still shaping up, and which way demand curves would really move. Part of it is defined by regulation and tariff design, but part of it is also designed by or defined by broader macroeconomic growth parameters. And so to that extent, unlike US or Europe, where demand curves have taken some shape and utilities have typically a good view of what's going to happen next 5-7 years, while not necessarily saying they know exactly well, but at least they have a better view than Indian discoms of next 5-7 years. So at this point in time, we should not worry too much about specific discoms load curve, and rather look at system as a whole, create some level of flexibility at the project level by adding something like 2 hours or maximum 3 hours of storage at the project level, and not necessarily go by each and every discom's individual needs, because fact remains their needs would actually change 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the line. And that's when we can actually decide whether we need to do large scale storage at the grid level or large scale storage at the project level. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Deepak. And now let me turn to Dr. Reddy of SECI to provide some remarks. Dr. Reddy?
Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Start your video?
Okay.
Can you please start your video, Dr. Reddy?
I think it has been stopped by you. I think host has stopped it.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll
I think now it's there.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's a very nice report, very nice presentation. It's very timely initiative by LBNL and Prayas. Okay. We are also have been working on requirement of storage. Being a national agency in the renewable energy sector, we realized this long back. From 2013 onwards, we have been working on this requirement of storage in the renewable power projects. Initially, we focused on intermittency aspects or the peak smoothing aspects of the renewable energy generation. So in view of that, we released some couple of tenders long back, but some way we couldn't realize. And then subsequently we tried number of individual projects also. Okay, but because of many factors, none of the projects were grounded. But with recent announcement of 450 gigawatt by our Honorable Prime Minister, we then shifted our thought process towards the large scale system integration to the grid. So means as you showed in the your presentation, by 2030 the peak demand might be around 300 gigawatt, 320 gigawatt. But what we can do with the 450 gigawatt of RE capacity addition, we have to address those things. We don't have much time, because if we start right now, the projects will come in 2 years time. By that time we'll be in 2022. So we thought that this is the right time. Then we studied the complete load curves of the country as published by POSOCO. Okay, the recent curves. Then we realized that we had to define some products at the system level. The report also rightly points out that when we comes to the discussion of the large scale storage, there will be always debate on to have the storage at grid level, independent storage at grid level, or to have at system level. But what we believe is that system level will give us a number of advantages. Okay, but grid level also can be done if you do proper value stacking of the storage. But unfortunately, the regulation is not there for the ancillary services or something. So it is emerging now, evolving now. Now what we realize is that at this moment, the project with at the project storage at project side is more relevant, and it is economical also. And I think your report says that it gives it reduces the cost of the storage. But with some of our studies, some of our initiatives in internal initiatives, what we realize is that we can improve the PLF of the plants. We can improve the overloading of the DC overloading of the solar projects, and we can very well flatten the curve actually. So we are doing number of projects also on that in some locations. And with keeping in that mind, we worked out three types of solutions. Like one is peaking power, and another is round the clock. Peaking power, anyway, it's everyone can understand that it's to meet the peak demands, as you showed in your presentation, just to make the peak demand of the discoms. Okay, in a flexible manner, we have defined that. But coming to the RTC, what we realized is that with the renewables, we have to, if you deploy simple renewables, similar capacity of the thermal also you must have for balancing. So maintaining that much thermal capacity and the technical minimums also you mentioned that. So that becomes very uneconomical. It means unviable. It means the maximum, if you observe complete renewable energy, some of the plants need to be operated at 20-30% levels, so which is not viable. So we did our analysis. Then what we found that we have to think some strategy and some replacement of complete replacement of the thermal also, some capacity. Because of that, we devised some tender a concept on RTC renewables, pure RTC renewables, and also the part RTC renewables. Okay, so that is one thing. And the other thing in your report also you mentioned that we are now working on the third mode of the thing. As the load shift happens from agriculture, night agriculture to day, all the things happens. What happens to the load of the discoms is nighttime load will be very minimum. So already thermal generation will be reduced. So we cannot have a renewable system which will generate in the night also. So what we are planning is that only to meet the daytime requirement for about 10 to 12 hours or 14 hours. So we are planning a firm renewable energy projects. Okay, so with stable generation and with some amount of flexibility to the discoms to schedule their power. So that we are working on it, and we released a concept paper on that also. We had a stakeholder meeting on that, and we received good response also. Soon we'll release that tender. And also as a company, we are also investing in number of projects also like that in solar wind hybrids with storage. Our numbers are also more or less close to our numbers. We are working for a project of solar wind hybrid project for 14 hours of delivery of power in a state where the storage penetration is around 13%, 14%. Our numbers are also like that, 3.3 to 3.5. Means what I meant to say is that the numbers whatever worked out in the report are more or less same. But one striking difference what we saw in your report is that the $200 per megawatt hour, sorry, kilowatt hour might be slightly less because in some of our recent tenders we received the quotes of around $400. Okay, some of the question answers also I'm seeing that the taxation on the batteries is so high in India, so that we need to address. Okay, in some of the forum we need to address that. Okay, so that is costing more. Okay, maybe if not 200, it might be 250 to 300. Okay, so it will come down, it will adjust. Okay, so that is one thing. And coming to the regulatory framework, we have been working with CRC, as Chatterjee sir mentioned that we are also in regular touch with CRC. Our top management is working with them. So means we are always striving towards for regulatory clarity also before releasing the bids actually. So we need to give multiple connectivity, all these things we are working with them. Okay. And the last one you mentioned that real-time market in the what is this RTC tender we addressed that also. Obviously, some of the reports by NREL also is there that storage slowly it will evolve. So right at this moment we have to work with some overcapacities also. Okay, overcapacity of generation. So with that, sometimes generation will be more than the requirement required to be scheduled to the RTC project. Sometimes they generate more. That we are allowing them to sell in the open market. Slowly we are trying to create a real-time market also with renewable energy. I think with that initiative will trigger something. Okay, then slowly we'll work on how to create some real-time market-based projects. So we are working on CFD concept also. We are working now. But everything, as Chatterjee was mentioning, that everything comes into the developing countries. That cost is the major factor. Okay, so of course we are working on it. Everything means all the aspects, and also some of the tenders like Chile and Excel Energy and Nevada also we analyzed. But they are different. They are developed for complete replacement of some capacities. But in India, it is a big national grid. Okay, so our approach is different. But we found that we should do it in a different way. Because of that, our recent activities are there. I hope we will be successful in this and will continue in this direction. Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Reddy. So now let me turn to Dr. Rahul Walawalkar, President of the India Energy Storage Alliance, to give us some industry perspective, and also there have been several questions on some of the supply chain issues. So speak a bit on those supply chain issues as well, if possible.
Sure. Thank you, Nikit, Shruti, and Ashwin for inviting me for this. And also thank you to LBNL for coming up with this report. I think this is very important. And as Sushanta sir has already mentioned, I think for CRC getting such report and numbers from independent organizations like LBNL is very important for their regulatory making. So really appreciate all the work which has gone into coming up with this report. Now, first, let me address the question related to the supply chain. I think there are a lot of questions about can India really have this supply chain, or does India only option for India is to just import this from China or other countries? So right now, definitely, I think there is a very heavy dependence on China, similar to solar. Maybe not as much as solar, because the global supply chain for batteries is a little bit more fragmented. The consolidation, what happened in solar with 90+% wafers coming from China, is not happening yet in energy storage space, and especially number of countries, including Korea, Europe, US, have considered especially advanced energy storage manufacturing as a national security priority. And as a result, there are significant investments taking place in every part of the world, where anywhere from 50 to 100 gigawatt hour of advanced cell manufacturing is taking place in US, Korea, or Europe now. So there will be a lot more options available. obviously, if in India, if the focus is only on the cheapest batteries, then yes, China does have that advantage. But one thing which probably we have uh, considerably failed in our effort as the India Energy Storage Alliance is to try to take this dialogue beyond capital cost of batteries. I think I've been facing this problem since 2012 or 2013 when we first started meeting with all the regulators, and probably I think Sushanta sir has been there in most of those meetings since 2012. And with even number of power ministers, where every time the question was, okay, when the batteries will become cheap. And in fact, we had presented a chart. I was just looking through a earlier presentation. So both to CRC as well as to IRENA and some of the international agencies. Back in 2014, we had projected the price drop to $200 per kilowatt hour for lithium-ion batteries by 2018. And that time, most of the other international companies like Navigant or Bloomberg had projections which are talking only about around $400 or $500 as a drop. So some of us had seen this price drop coming in. But one part, if we really have to promote manufacturing, is that we have to get demand. And this is not going to happen just by waiting for manufacturing to scale up, because obviously the people who are looking at investing billions of dollars in setting up this manufacturing, they are also looking for market signal, that they are trying to see if India is really going to take lead in this adoption, or if India will be the laggard in this, and India will wait for 10 years for getting enough examples from rest of the countries before deploying some of these projects. The other factor I would like to mention is that when you look at the total system cost for building, it is not just about the battery cost. Ultimately, as an all-in cost, the battery cost may be only around 30 or 35% of the cost, or if you're looking at 4 hours or longer, maybe around 50-60% of the cost. There is a lot of cost reduction in terms of the levelized cost will happen when you start actually optimizing these ESS systems and then also operate them in a more efficient way, because obviously in a levelized cost calculation, you have certain numbers in the denominator in terms of the cycle life and total energy throughput of the battery, and that is not a steady number. How you operate the battery, how you size it, even how you size the air conditioning for the system could have a huge impact on how much cycles you are going to get. So some of these numbers in these studies is fine as a guidelines, but ultimately as an industry, we need to get that experience. And that's the part where I think our regret is that in India, last 5 years, we have just talked. And although SECI had taken a number of initiatives for projects, unfortunately, none of those projects have got implemented. And one challenge which I think from the manufacturing side we are facing is that there are so many cases in India where the storage is already cost effective. It is not the cheapest solution, but it is cost effective as compared to the alternate solutions which are there, like classic example, Andaman Nicobar, right? Again, it's a small market, it's just a 70-80 megawatt of diesel generation. But back in 2014, it was economical to shut down those DP sets and move to solar plus storage. We could have had a cost less than what we were paying for diesel. 3 years back, those costs were almost half of what it is costing for running diesel. And still, we have just one pilot project in Andaman Nicobar for just less than 1 hour of storage. So this is the part where I think regulators needs to really step up. And again, I don't envy Sushanta sir or other regulators, because obviously policy making in uncertainty is a very tough task, and always people will blame if something goes wrong. But one thing which we are missing in India is actually some bureaucrat or some regulator or some minister who really believes in this concept and is not just waiting for someone else to come up with more studies. Because as more and more studies are coming, there will be more studies about hydrogen, where someone will come and say, no, don't spend money on batteries. Batteries will create environmental waste. Wait for another 10 years and there will be everything hydrogen. So always these type of studies will keep on coming up. But somewhere I think we need to have regulators to clearly drive the market by getting these projects. And there is a learning curve. I think for these initial projects, because we don't have sufficient capacity in India for the deployment in this area, it is fine to have like 2-year kind of a lead time. But as we have seen from number of projects from ES or Tesla and others, these ESS projects can be deployed in a span of less than 6 months. So I think waiting on a 3-year project development cycle, we leave India way out of this complete global supply chain. So we need to start identify projects which can be deployed in 6 months, 9 months, and start moving and building this capacity in the industry. But if that happens, then I think there are already a lot of work which has happened from Niti Aayog, where there is a advanced cell chemistry manufacturing mission, which is about to get launched. We believe on 15 July there is a cabinet meeting. The final approval is expected unless someone stops it. So there is a lot of work which is going to happen, and supply chain is getting in place. But we really need the demand to pick up. And the only question we have in our mind is, will it happen on the grid side or behind the meter? Because even traditionally, India is a $5 billion market for lead acid batteries, because utilities or regulators have never valued reliability. So any customer who can afford it, the only option for him is to have a UPS system and have these lead acid batteries as a backup. So same transition we will see on even the advanced energy storage technology. So we project that there will be more than 150 gigawatt hour of storage deployed in India within the next 5 years. Unless regulators step up and new developers step up, we will see most of it happening behind the meter, because there the economics is already becoming very, very evident for especially renewable storage.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Rahul. So I think let's quickly turn to the Q&A session, and I'm going to request Ashwin of Prayas Energy Group to moderate the Q&A session. So Ashwin, so can you just quickly provide some key takeaways from the discussion so far, and then move on to the Q&A? I know you have been monitoring the Q&As as well. So please, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nikit. Again, apologies to everyone, but we still see over 200 participants. We are a bit behind time, but I'll keep it brief. I think there was a mention that, you know, these numbers are realistic, but maybe on the lower side. And as Shruti mentioned, we haven't looked at the taxation of the land cost. That could be one reason. But the import of the analysis is not the specific number, whether it's 2 rupees or 3 rupees. The direction that the costs are dropping drastically, that is very, very important, and no one is debating that. And so the scale at which you can procure batteries, the flexibility it provides, and the cost that is dropping, that is the important analysis. It could be 50 paise up and down depending on, you know, local taxes, duties, so on and so forth. But I think that is the important point, and that, as Dr. Chatterjee said, has literally profound implications for generation planning in the coming years. So one thing, if you look at it, unlike a thermal power plant, RE plus storage is very modular, very short gestation, and it gives you a very low risk optionality. You can keep adding projects as your load grows. You don't need to think of 5 years and 10 years ahead. And that's a very strong risk mitigation strategy for discoms. And this is seriously a big opportunity for discoms to flatten the curve, even if we haven't flattened the pandemic curve. But, you know, it's a possibility for flattening the cost procurement curve. This is a real possibility. And I'm sure even sales migration and CNI consumers are going to take benefit of this. So this is an opportunity for discoms and for the electricity sector. And, you know, planning really needs to be fundamentally rethought in this light. I'll ask a few questions, because I know we've had a lot of questions. We'll try and answer a lot of them after the webinar, but I'll take some of them together, especially in the interest of time. One question, the first one I have for Dr. Chatterjee is, someone wants to know, what are the market instruments that can promote storage in day-ahead markets or real-time markets?
Thanks, Ashwin. In fact, my personal view is that, you know, for a day-ahead market, at least I am not expecting a standalone storage to come purely as an independent player to participate in the day-ahead market. What possibly makes sense is a hybrid or a combination with solar, wind, and if a project, solar project or a wind project plus the storage is set up, it can pretty well participate in the day-ahead market. And as we look forward to increasing the depth of the day-ahead market going forward, assuming we have some form of market-based economic dispatch over in future, you will have different price formations during the day in terms of evening peak and others. So I do not think we need a separate market instrument for encouraging renewable on the day-ahead time horizon, but my take would be for real-time market. Now we have created, it has already come into place from 1st of June, and the performance of the real-time market has been much better than what in fact we had estimated for. And there, whether you talk in terms of the renewables or renewable with storage or standalone storage, the real-time market, in my opinion, provides a good market platform and instrument for these technologies to thrive on their own without supporting for any kind of a regulatory favors. So that's in brief from my side.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. Deepak, next to you, a lot of questions on which location gets most value for storage. So is it combined with the project itself as a generation plant co-located, or whether it's procured by the DISCOM, and where the location is, as a transmission asset at the distribution end, or at the regional level or state level. So people want to know about that.
So as I alluded to earlier, Ashwin, my sense is that little bit of storage at the generation asset does have some value. It can help us balance ramp ups and ramp downs, and also really give a good sort of forecast and being able to meet with the forecast. But as soon as we talk about very large scale storage, there are two specific places where it would make more sense than at the project level. One is at the transmission level, where common resources can be accessed by load dispatch centers to deal with vagaries of demand and supply both. And second, at the distribution end, to deal with the frequency challenges. So storage has value at all the levels. The quantum and the type of storage obviously would matter and would vary between three places where it can be put. And as Rahul pointed out, even at the consumer end in certain specific applications, storage does have some value.
Thanks, Deepak. Next, coming to Rahul, I have two questions. One, a lot of people were asking about the taxation, the high level of taxation on storage in India, and what the industry feels about that. And the second question was on, we have shown these prices especially for large scale utility scale projects, but do the same trends hold for smaller size projects, say a few megawatts, or even at the consumer end?
Sure. So in terms of the taxes, actually, this is an area where, as an India Energy Storage Alliance, we are just actually constituting a task force to look into it deeply. But as Aditya Trivedi from AES has commented on chat, these taxes are actually very country specific. So depending on the country of origin, these taxes, all-in taxes could vary anywhere from 30 to 45%, because there are a lot of basic customs duty or other things which are country specific, where certain preferred countries it may be 0 or maybe 5%, but for China it could be 15 to 20%. So that makes a huge difference in terms of the taxes and cost. So on one side, we are seeing like a lot of these projects taking place in US or Europe, where there are certain investment tax credits or other thing which is there. And in India, we have actually almost like sort of a reverse thing of it, where there is a almost 30 to 40% additional tax adder. And then we keep on waiting for the battery cost to come down by another 20% or 30%. So I feel that there are a lot of ways in which actually within existing policy frameworks, I think MNRE or CRC can take the initiative to at least allow some of these initial projects where these tax exemptions can come in and help it. So it is not that we need any more specific subsidy or specific tariff for storage projects. In fact, as IESA, we have been advocating from start that just stop not allowing storage for participating in some of these things. But we need to just provide a level playing field. And if the cost point is really important, then taxation is another point, apart from similar to Shruti in your paper you have addressed about interest rate. So those two factors are also equally important than just waiting for the manufacturing cost to come down.
Thanks, Rahul. Just a couple of more questions to Dr. Reddy. Sir, what has been your experience dealing with the distribution companies, the procurers? How is their perception of storage or flexibility and price when they're getting this flexibility and dispatchability with renewables?
We are approaching most of the procurers actually, the DISCOMs. Many of them they're interested, but there are a number of other things also parallelly happening. Even the simple solar prices are going down, and it is taking some time to take the decision. But as a concept, everyone is appreciating that. But commercial decisions that taking some time. I think they will be closing soon. We are not seeing any any comments on that. Everyone is appreciating the what is the initiatives of SECI in both RTC and also in the peaking power tenders. We are hopeful that we will be closing the contracts also soon.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Reddy. One more question to Rahul. There's a bunch of questions related to second life of batteries, disposal of batteries, and recycling of batteries. Could you broadly take a look at that?
Sure. In terms of recycling, I think for battery industry, it is very important. And again, although even traditionally lead acid batteries get a lot of blame in India for that, but as a globally as an industry, lead acid industry, in fact, has more than 95% recycling. In India, more of a problem has been that the recycling has been happening in a fragmented way without any proper environmental controls. Similarly, for lithium-ion batteries, maybe around 7-8 years back, the concern was that lithium-ion battery recycling was not cost-effective, and you would have to pay money for doing recycling. But that has changed quite rapidly, especially in last 3-4 years, with emergence of some of the chemistries which has heavy cobalt content. And with that, actually now you can recycle these batteries in a cost-effective way. In fact, there are a lot of secondary usage of some of the components used in a battery for even pharmaceutical or other industries. So it's not necessarily that the recycled materials have to go back into the battery supply chain itself. But yes, there is a need for a comprehensive regulatory mechanism which is enforced for ensuring that the recycling happens in a proper way. Already there is a huge amount of lithium-ion or other recyclable batteries from consumer electronics is there in India. So it is not about just question 10 years down the line, but it is a initiative which we need to take right away. When it comes to typically second life batteries, people are referring to actually batteries from the mobility or the electric vehicles, where once maybe the capacity reduces to some extent, probably the drivers do not want to have this problem of charging the vehicles too frequently. So they would be inclined to changing these batteries, but these batteries can still be used for stationary application. So there is a lot of work happening in that place. Right now, in fact, there is an opportunity because from Europe or other places, secondary battery is not necessarily at end of the vehicle life, but even there are secondary batteries which are sort of a factory rejects from mainstream auto OEMs, where maybe they have not met some parameters are available. But right now, actually in India, we are not allowed to import those batteries. So those are things. I think there are regulatory frameworks which are required to be evolved, but this should not be an issue because there is a value in the materials which are used in these batteries, and there is enough work. Already IESA has launched an initiative last October called India Recycling and Reuse Initiative, where we have companies like Fortum and Israel Chemicals Limited have already committed. They are ready to set up recycling facilities in India if the regulatory framework can come in shape. And already Ministry of Environment has come up with draft regulations in that regard.
Thank you, Rahul. With this, I think, unfortunately, we will have to close the Q&A session. There are plenty of questions still probably unanswered and very interesting ones. We'll try to come back to those individual attendees with some response later on. The recording of the webinar and the slides will be put up in a few days, and so that you can share with people who haven't been able to participate. But I would really and sincerely thank my co-panelists, Deepak, Rahul, and Dr. Reddy, and of course, Dr. Chatterjee for providing very context opening remarks, and also my co-authors. And most importantly, we have had over 250 active participants. We nearly have 200 right now. So that shows to, talks to the interest in this sector. And we are quite inspired by that, and we'll continue to work on this. Thank you, everyone, and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.